What if history isn't simply remembered? What if history is edited, curated, designed? That's the premise of Children of the Matrix, designer history. And in this chapter, David Icke explores a radical question. What if much of what we think we know about history has been filtered through systems of power? What's fascinating is the echoes, warnings from George Orwell long before this book. Because Orwell said, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And that may be one of the deepest spiritual questions of all. Who writes reality? Let's go there. In this chapter, Icke suggests history may not simply unfold. It may be framed, told through the perspective of power. And if you think about it, history is often written by victors, by institutions, and by empires, by those who survived long enough to tell the story. So the question becomes, how much of history is objective and how much is narrative? That alone changes everything. Orwell saw this coming. 1984 wasn't just fiction, it was a warning. In Orwell's world, truth becomes flexible, memory becomes manipulated, language itself becomes a control system. And doesn't that sound familiar? Because control doesn't always begin with force. Sometimes it begins by altering what people believe is true. Once truth is unstable, people become easier to govern. That was Orwell's warning. History as programming. This chapter asks something provocative. What if historical narratives are not education, but programming? Think about what we're taught. Who are the heroes? Who are the villains? What events mattered? Which stories are repeated? Which disappear? Every civilization passes on myth, but who decides what becomes official reality? That's the deeper question, and that question matters. This is where the chapter gets really fascinating because it moves from history into perception. What if collective memory can be shaped through repetition, media, education, propaganda, cultural myth? If something is repeated enough, people often mistake repetition for truth. This is not conspiracy, this is psychology, and that is why this chapter matters. Designer history in the inner world. Now this is where I take it inward, because there's outer history and personal history. And many of us carry designer history inside ourselves. Stories we inherited. I'm not worthy. I'm broken. I always get abandoned. Those are internal narratives, conditioned identities. And awakening often means rewriting personal history too. Not changing facts, changing meaning. That is liberation. This is where sovereignty begins. Who benefits from distorted history? Because if people don't know their real history, they lose orientation. And if people lose orientation, they become dependent on authority to tell them reality. That applies politically, spiritually, and psychologically. Why the truth matters, and why questioning narrative matters. Not because every alternative theory is true, but because blind acceptance is dangerous. One thing Orwell understood deeply: language shapes consciousness. Change the words, you change thought. Limit thought, you limit perception. You limit freedom. That's profound, because freedom begins in consciousness, and consciousness begins in language. That's why truth telling matters. That's why naming things matters. That's why words matter. Here's what I take from designer history. Question the narratives, including your own. Question what you've inherited. Question what you've been taught to fear. Question the stories that make you smaller. Because awakening is not believing every hidden theory. Awakening is becoming conscious enough to investigate. There's a difference, and that distinction matters. What if the real battle is over perception? Maybe the deepest battle has never been for territory, but perception, because whoever shapes perception shapes reality. And maybe that's what Orwell was really warning us about. And maybe that's the bigger chapter that this chapter is pointing towards. Not paranoia, awareness, discernment, sovereignty. Maybe history is just isn't just something we study. Maybe it's something we're constantly being invited to question when we stop outsourcing truth. If this resonates, subscribe, because I'm walking chapter by chapter through this of the Matrix and exploring these ideas through awakening, consciousness, and sovereignty. And let me know in the comments, do you think history is discovered or designed? I'd love to hear your thoughts.